according to the International Diabetes Federation's Atlas 10th edition, more than 500 million people worldwide live with diabetes, and more than 4.2 million South Africans suffer from the condition. Now, manageable but also life-threatening, diabetes is a chronic disease that occurs either when the pancreas does not produce enough insulin or when the body cannot effectively use the insulin that it produces. Now, World Diabetes Day is being observed today to highlight diabetes as a global public health challenge. And to talk to us more about this, we joined here in studio by Dr Mosima Mabunda, who's Head of Wellness at Discovery Vitality South Africa. Dr Mabunda, so good to have you with us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, and good morning to you and your viewers. Thank you for having me.
You know, today is such an important day because when we talk about 4.2 million South Africans having to deal with diabetes and all that is attendant with it, that's quite a sizable number. So how big is, the scourge of diabetes in South Africa?
So I'm going to start with the global stat that you mentioned, where you said over 500 million people globally are living with diabetes. That number is projected to get to over 1 billion by 2050 if things continue as they are. And in South Africa, 4.2 million people are living with diabetes. But what makes me quite sad is at least 1 in 2 people that have diabetes don't know. Right? So we're saying there's a lot of people with diabetes, but there's an equally high number of people that might have diabetes and they don't know, which brings to bear the importance of days like today to raise awareness. And we also know that globally, diabetes kills at least 2 million people. When I was thinking about that this morning, I'm like, think about the population of Mauritius or Kingdom of Eswatini. That is the equivalent of wiping out that population on an annual basis. I think when you try and bring this stats closer to home, it just highlights why everyone is trying to raise awareness about diabetes. And what we see is what's driving this rise in prevalence of diabetes is type 2 diabetes, where it affects at least more than 90% of people that have diabetes. And I think we were chatting earlier about diabetes and we expect it to happen later in life. One of the things I highlighted is one of the reasons we're seeing a high increase in the rates of diabetes is this obesity pandemic, as we call it, that we're seeing. And what is fascinating about that is it is resulting in us seeing what is termed as early onset diabetes. So we have a problem. We can manage it and we'll talk about it, but we have a problem, and days like today are quite important to make all of us aware that diabetes is a thing. It is important to know your risk because some people don't know they're living with it. You can manage it, but you can't manage it if you don't know that you have it.
So, which is very interesting because, as you say, 90% of sufferers are type 2 diabetics, but there is, of course, type 1 diabetics as well. Perhaps just drawing the distinction, because I want to touch on the fact that, as you say, sometimes people live with diabetes and they don't know. So what would be some of the symptoms in both type 1 and type 2 that should perhaps move you to go and have yourself tested?
So maybe just a few seconds to step back to bring everyone up to speed. When we say diabetes, so diabetes is a lifelong condition that results in your blood sugar being higher than it should be. I'm seeing the image on the screen. So that's typically what happens when you go and screen and you test for diabetes. And we've mentioned that there is type 1 and type 2 diabetes, right? In type 1 diabetes, that's typically in childhood. That's when it's picked up, and that's where the body mounts an autoimmune response that ultimately stops the body from being able to produce insulin. In type 2 diabetes, which is most common and it's adult onset, though now we're seeing younger adults having it, you have a situation where your body does not respond to insulin as well as it should. And many people ask the question you asked to say, so what are the symptoms? I want to know the symptoms so that when I know I've got symptoms, I can go check. But type 2 diabetes happens over time. It's gradual in onset. It's not all of a sudden. And though I'll share some of the symptoms, I would not recommend that you rely on symptoms because you might not know that it's diabetes. So, for example, some people will feel thirsty, or you find that you actually urinate or pee a lot more often, you have fatigue. But you can see that those symptoms are common to any other condition. They're not necessarily unique to diabetes. So for me, the recommendation, and in line with clinical guidelines, the mainstay is preventative screenings. And I think that's why, like in the work that I do in Vitality, realizing this, we incentivize members to screen, because if you're going to sit and wait for symptoms to arise, unfortunately, it might be at a time when complications have arisen and it becomes challenging to actually manage your diabetes.
So where and how do you screen?
So generally, in a few places in healthcare settings, so many pharmacies have got clinics where you can screen. There's a nurse there that can do a finger prick test. Your clinician, your GP can also screen. Government clinics across the board and hospitals would also be able to offer screening services. So in healthcare centers, you should be able to actually go and screen for diabetes. And when you do screen, they will be able to communicate your results. But what's most important is it's not just screening and you go. So screening, if your glucose is high enough to warrant diabetes, they will connect you to management. But what I like about doing preventative screening is then you get advised about how to reduce your risk of diabetes. Things like if it's found that you have obesity, you would be advised on how can you change your behavior, how do you change your lifestyle to start eating more healthy, or connect with support structures that are available to help you eat healthy, and also how do you make sure that you adhere to regular exercise, because those two have been shown to modulate obesity and ultimately reduce the risk of diabetes.
So you spoke about type 1 and, that usually being detected during early childhood. But for parents, again, what would you look out for? Because I would imagine sometimes you would not know that your child may be diabetic. So are there any telltale signs that perhaps you need, again, to have your child screened?
So unlike type 2 diabetes, the symptoms for type 1 diabetes can happen all of a sudden. So just like if you're speaking about diabetes and any other illness, when your child is not well, typically parents would go and consult. So I feel like with type 1 diabetes, because the symptoms happen all of a sudden, it will alert the parents that my child is not well. Let me go and take them to see a clinician. Whereas in type 2 diabetes, it happens over time, and it is not something that you would ultimately realize. And many adults are not so great at healthcare seeking behaviors versus parents that tend to, every single thing that happens in their child, they're a lot more aware, and they tend to actually err more on the side of caution and take them to clinical services.
Dr. Mabunda, what about quality, medication once one has been diagnosed? Do we find that is easily available for South Africans?
So I think you bring an important point around, if you have diabetes, how do you manage it? So for me, the first point to highlight is lifestyle behaviors. Lifestyle interventions are the mainstay of managing diabetes. I've mentioned healthy eating, I've mentioned physical activity, but there are also structured weight management programs that your clinician can recommend or refer you to, where typically led by a dietitian, that help you get a diet plan. They coach you through the process, because it's not as easy to go on the journey alone. So the foundation and mainstay, as you discuss with your clinician, is lifestyle interventions. They're quite critical. And then if you do need medication, your clinician would recommend medication appropriate for you. And the privilege of living in a country like South Africa, medications are available in all, whether in public or in the private sector. Many people that have diabetes can access medications, and the medications have been shown to actually manage diabetes fairly well.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'm so glad we did have a moment to talk about, diabetes, and of course, as you say, a lifestyle, very important, exercise, a good diet, following those rules in order to perhaps try and prevent, or when you have diabetes, perhaps try and manage and reverse some of those symptoms. But thanks so much to Dr. Mosima Mabunda, who's Head of Wellness at Discovery Vitality, talking to us about preventing and living with diabetes as we mark World Diabetes Day.